Dr. Rabowski's when he was invited to come as a Lenahan scholar. And he's progressed in all kinds of wonderful ways, including a performance that I saw writing Metamorphosis, which you've been in several other plays and written one. And we're going to hear a little bit about what you've been working on in terms of your script writing and looking at it through the lenses of French and French culture. So I'm delighted to turn the floor over to you so that you can introduce your faculty and your topic.
All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks for coming out. I just want to start with a question. After the experience of seeing a really good play or a really good film, who has ever left the theater or turned off the television with a sense of great excitement but sort of a mystery as to why did I like that? Beyond the fact that it made me laugh or it made me cry, who has ever wondered why exactly was that good? Anyone? Okay. Okay, that's good. Well, me too. And that's sort of the question that propelled me to doing this research for this Capstone project. I often leave a theater after seeing a film or play with great excitement, but I'm often left wondering, why exactly was that good? I know it has something to do with dramatic structure. I also know it has something to do with language. But the question is, what exactly is that? It's easy enough to say, well, that was an effective piece because it was well formulated and it sounded real. That's an answer that I could have come up with at any age, at any time. My question for this project kind of goes beyond that, asking how these two disciplines, language and dramatic structure, work together to enliven a piece of art. To approach this question, I'm going to pull from my academic background in drama and language, and in my case, the French language. Okay. I'm going to analyze films by the French filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard. Godard's a well-known and influential director and a pioneer of the French New Wave movement in the 1950s and 60s. And after researching his films and figuring out what he's doing with drama and with language, the second part of my project is writing in response to the research I've done. So for my resources, I used books as a starting point to sort of refresh my knowledge of dramatic structure and also get a better sense of the artist himself, Godard. Richard Brody is a film critic from The New Yorker, and he wrote a very excellent biography that sort of gave me a blueprint of how to think about Godard and the setting that he sort of created his work. And the films Contempt and The 400 Blows and Presentation are not necessarily films by Godard, but just films surrounding him that he was either in or that friends of his were doing at the time, to sort of give me an idea of what sort of work they were doing in that specific time period. So I've identified 6 topics to look at when I look at these scenes from these films. Dramatically, I'm going to look at premise, which refers to the basis of an argument in a scene, and it should be in conviction. And it's important to establish a premise as a guideline for further analysis. Movement of a scene refers to the transitions in action and dialogue, sort of the beats between the language that help the scene move forward. The strength or the will of a character doesn't necessarily refer to whether or not a character is likable, but rather if they're willing to fight for what they believe in. And the orchestration refers to the actions of characters moving in opposition, creating something cohesive, sort of like a musicality of an orchestra, where you have different instruments in different pitches and sounds, but combined sort of create something cohesive and unified. And the French elements that I'm going to look at are pace and diction. Pace refers to the rate of movement at which the characters speak, and this can be measured by timing the seconds of pauses between lines, and also by calculating the words per minute of each character. And the diction refers to the words that the characters choose to use. And this will be interesting to look at in French because, as opposed to English, everything to me in French is fascinating because it's a language I'm still learning, and each word has power. And so I'll be able to really look at the words in a less colloquial way and a more significant way. So the 3 films I looked at were Breathless, My Life to Live, and Masculine Feminine. Breathless is Godard's first film. My Life to Live is a film he made with his ex-wife, Anna Karina. And Masculine Feminine is a film he made in response to the youth popular culture of the early 1960s in France, which he called The Children of Marx and Coca-Cola, which I thought was kind of funny. And I just want an example of a film I looked at and sort of the research I was doing. Breathless takes place in Paris and centers on the love story between Michel, the gentleman on the left, and Patricia, who's an American woman living in Paris, on the right. Michel is a criminal sort of on the run, and Patricia is engaged in a romantic relationship with him, sort of a restless adventure. And the scene that I looked at takes place at the very end of the film, where Patricia decides to turn him into the police and essentially try to take control of her life again and escape this sort of her restless ways with him. Patricia says, as they speak, "If I loved you, oh, I don't know." To which Michelle answers, "You believe in independence, but you aren't." This is one example in which the language is aiding the dramatic action forward. The pace of the scene is slow and almost dreamy, and with strong diction by Michelle's character, he's essentially ensuring her that she is indeed not independent. Calling the police is to her an act of breaking away from this relationship, but through language, Michelle is at once bringing her back towards him and also reminding her that she is indeed not a strong character, which is up to the audience to decide, but it's an example of how language is sort of used to make some sort of dramatic action move forward. In terms of the interdisciplinary concept I used to draw conclusions, the first one was iteration, and this had to do with using the ideas and the data obtained from each of these disciplines and coming up with conclusions that used vocabulary from both to sort of come to some sort of conclusion. The second was bridging the explanation-action gap, and for me this was figuring out, trying to answer this question I proposed at the beginning of the presentation, trying to use this research to reach some sort of conclusion, and then the action of my particular was the action of an artist, which is to do, which is my case, to write this play. So just a few conclusions. Looking at the films in a different language allowed me to notice how language works in a very direct manner. While in English I take much for granted, I'm constantly fascinated by French, and in this project I was able to identify how language is more than something instinctual, but rather is a tool to ignite the drama of a scene. Drama and language work together to make a film or a play interesting. They're two tools that a writer can express themselves in their own authentic, unique way. I used to admire Godard's films because I felt a connection to them, which is a very sort of base and very visceral thing to say. But now I realize that I admire him because he's using these two disciplines to make work that is authentic. And that's sort of getting back to the question I proposed. In my opinion, this authenticity that I speak of is sort of what elevates art, as I say, from a technical to artistic triumph. In authentic state, it's important to grab from each discipline to ignite your work. So I'd like to read an excerpt from the play that I wrote in response to this. And I'm fortunate enough to have two actors from the UMBC theater department read just a brief part of this play. But before I do that, I just want to thank, I'd like to thank Ms. Lanou and Mr. McAlpin and everyone at INDS and Mr. Scott, everyone for their help, and also my advisors, Dr. Field and Dr. McCulley, just for helping me kind of figure this out and try to answer this question as best I could. So we'll read a little excerpt of the play, and then I'd love to answer some questions. And I'll read stage directions. It's new for me. Okay. So Paul and Emily walk down the street, cross each other, and see each other. Then the projection reads, "Some hours after." They cross by each other again. Emily appears annoyed. Paul approaches Emily.
Can I offer you a cafe?
Do I know you?
No, but I believe we crossed paths a few hours ago, and I told myself it was destiny that I speak to you.
If you pay.
Really?
Yes.
Okay, let's go.
They arrive at a cafe and sit down.
May I record you? You have a lovely voice.
Yes, I suppose so. You live in the neighborhood?
Now I live not far away, but concretely, I live nowhere. I haven't asked your name.
Paul. Etui?
Emily.
Highlighted with pearls.
What?
I do things like this. The phrases are beautiful in the afternoon.
You're still trying to be polite.
I know. I'll stop if you press stop.
Deal. Always have a backup.
Okay, so that's just a brief excerpt, sort of a Godard-esque style of writing, but really influenced by the importance of dramatic structure and also kind of playing with the language in my own authentic way. So thank you guys. I appreciate it. Thanks. Yes, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Yes?
If I heard you correctly, you defined
In this case, yeah. I mean,
Because and help me understand, I thought diction was how you pronounce words.
well, that's one of the definitions. The definition of diction that I'm using is word choice, like the literal word choice. That a character is not necessarily based on regionalism or where they're from, but more like in the moment, the words they're choosing.
Which discipline to theater is how you.
Linguistics too, you use it sometimes.
Okay.
See, it's interesting, because for me, I took it from the perspective of language, but at the same time, it is an element of theater, which is sort of kind of why this project was so interdisciplinary, is because for me, I was looking at it through the French perspective in sort of an existential way, more like the process of the language, as opposed to in English, where if I approach just a word or a sentence, I sort of take it for granted. But because French is such a kind of new thing to me, I could look at it and say, okay, this artist is using this word to communicate this dramatic idea, kind of how the two disciplines are related. Yeah.
Patrick, what was the challenge, so in writing your own play, how challenging was it to recreate that authenticity that you so admire in drama?
Well, I think a lot of it for me was to keep paying attention to these 6 topics that I addressed and keep asking myself, am I doing this, am I doing this, am I doing that? Because a lot of times people mistake authenticity for sort of, let me just free verse and just out. And that's all, there's a place for that, but I feel like in drama and in theater, you really need to put it under a microscope and really challenge what it is you're saying and allow yourself to edit and allow yourself to change it based on sort of the research I've done. And it's interesting because Godard, as a filmmaker, is sort of the opposite of that. He's someone that just improvised lines and dialogue and just shot sort of on a whim. And for me, I'm taking more of like a methodical approach to it. So I find a union between those two kind of extremes. Yeah.
The terms that you use, premise, realistic character, where do those words come from? A particular scholar, or
I forgot
I know what they all meant, but I wasn't sure.
I forgot to mention that in the resources part, the book that I used to sort of get a foundation for drama is The Art of Dramatic Writing by Lagos Egri, and it's sort of an older book, but it's many sort of Aristotle bits. And as I mentioned, there were maybe 20 different topics, and I just kind of picked those 4 because I felt like they had a lot to do with the relationship between drama and language. Yes.
Did your study of French, you wrote your play in English, correct?
Yeah.
Did your study of French influence at all the way that you constructed the play?
It did. Well, actually, I have in the play voiceovers in French, in a literal way it did, but also in a sense of, just like I said, this sort of almost existential process of language, right, where the words mean a lot more, as they do to me in French, not necessarily for a native. This is not a project for a native French speaker, but to me, it kind of has that translated into English, where every word matters, as opposed to, this play, unlike a lot of my other writing, is not sort of long monologues that are very neurotic and wordy. This is more brief sentences getting the point across, and that has everything to do, I think, with my studying of French.
I just saw Breathless for the first time last month. And there are a lot of French directors, different, very good. Why Godard? What was it about him that made you think that could inform your project more than another selection?
Well, a lot of choosing Godard had to do, first because I really admire him, sort of compared him to Bob Dylan in terms of the way he made films and he did not really care about what anyone else thought. And that was, going into it, that was why I chose him. And it was interesting because a lot of my conclusions have to do with that same idea, but I just never realized it. Why do I like him? Because he does what he wants, because he's authentic, and it's really an act of artistic bravery to be that authentic. And so, yeah, I mean, in a sense, it became full circle for me. The reason that I picked him and sort of the conclusion that I drew were sort of the same.
That's really interesting what you just said in terms of being an artist. Whether you're an actor or a painter or a song player. Those people who do what they want no matter what get a lot of criticism for some of us in academia to conform for different reasons. And maybe years later
a really, and I was actually thinking about this on the drive here. I think that it has a lot to do with the reason that I went to a university for 4 years instead of graduating high school and saying I'm an artist, let me get to work, whatever that means, is because I think that kind of the 4 years of study here and the research I've done and the communication with faculty, regardless of whether or not I agreed with everything, it all kind of informs your voice. Your voice has to come from somewhere beyond just sort of your inner thoughts. And I think a lot of what I took away from this research and some other research that I've done in the past is you have to allow things to inform what you're doing. Even Bob Dylan read the newspaper every day and looked through the headlines for lyrics. He didn't just, do you know what I mean? He didn't just come up with it. So I think everything has to come from somewhere. And it's true that often in academia, you sort of, there's pros and cons to an artist like Godard. I mean, in Brody's biography, he certainly wasn't polite in assessments of his films. But at the same time, you have to acknowledge that this artist is doing what they want to do. And for me, it's finding the relationship between that and between sort of the education that I've gotten, because you can't just take that for granted. That has to inform your work, I feel like, at every step. Or you're not really developing as much as you can be, I think. Yes?
Is it possible for you to give us a little bit of a sense of what the context is for this scene that you presented to us? Because with a snippet like that, it's hard to see where it's coming from. Is this the beginning?
This is actually at the very end of the, my play.
Your play.
Oh, not, I'm sorry.
Your play.
This is the first, the play essentially is sort of a love triangle between Emily and Thomas, who are together and sort of naive, and then Paul, who's sort of a James Dean type character that comes in. And this is the first time that Paul and Emily meet on the street, on the sort of on the, I have it taking place in Paris, so on the road. And it sort of speaks to his sort of James Dean nature and her sort of quirky, and she ends up becoming sort of this mysterious character that sort of controls the entire play. The play itself is actually only 15 pages, which was also a challenge for me, was to kind of confine it to sort of what I've been doing in script analysis. This happens, which makes this happen, keeping it very concise. But yeah, I wish I could read the whole. By all means, I'll send it to you, and hopefully I'll be producing it sometime soon. Yeah. I guess out of context, it was a bit.
Well, it sounded like Godard a little bit, but
Yeah.
it's hard to tell. Yeah.